Hello! In the last video, we studied the King's Indian type 2 position from White's perspective, and we saw two plans. White could attack on the queen side by playing b2, b4, or he could attack on the king side and center by playing f2, f4. Both plans are promising if they are applied in the right position, and to be honest, there is really not a lot more that White can hope for. There are no other targets to pursue. Now, in this video, we will study this position from Black's perspective. I should point out that the break f7, f5 is pretty much the only good plan that Black has in this position. One might be tempted to also play b7, b5, but that plan is actually likely to fail in most positions. Now, let me give you a quick explanation for why. Suppose that Black were to play a6 and then b5, White could probably play a3 and then b4. Then pretty soon we would have pawns on these yellow squares, and those pawns would probably end up getting traded. Now when that happens, what happens? The queen side opens up. White continues to have this space advantage of having the d5 pawn versus the d6 pawn, and in fact, that pawn on d6 becomes quite vulnerable. It was always kind of vulnerable, but now the position is open, so it's a lot easier to be attacked, which puts Black in a bad position. So this plan with a6, b5 is actually not very likely to work out for Black at all. So we are left with f7, f5. Let's see the next example. So in this example, we will see how to play the position from Black's perspective. We could say that, this example doesn't necessarily showcase a clear plan for Black, but the key message to take away is that in this pawn structure, Black is somewhat capable of neutralizing the power of White's queenside play. And this allows to create a long struggle with many maneuvers. And in such positions, strong players often thrive because they are able to get a long fight, they avoid piece trades, and eventually they are able to outplay somewhat weaker players. Now throughout the first games, or throughout the first 30 or so moves in this game, we will see that Black focuses on preventing White's two standard plans. So basically Black will be focusing on preventing this b4 and this f4 breaks, and then he will proceed to create a decisive attack on the king side. So the game started with, d4, d6, knight f3. Okay, and essentially we are going into a standard King's Indian position. So after knight f6, knight c3, castle and bishop e2, we have the most common position in the King's Indian. Knight d7. This is a sideline. It's actually a very respectable line, but it is not one of the most common. The important thing to keep in mind here is that Black is probably trying to avoid main theoretical lines and just get a standard position where he can play for a long game. So, for example here, the bishop could have returned to d2 as well, but he chose to return to h4, which makes it a bit harder for Black to play f5. But anyways, Black continued with a5, knight h6, and now he continued with a standard rearrangement by playing knight f7. So let's continue. So rook b1, h5. Now Black is threatening to play g5 and trap the bishop. So White has to play f3, then bishop h6, queen e7, b3. Now we might be wondering, why didn't White play a3? The idea of a3 is to play b2, b4 in one move rather than two. But the point is that now Black has the usual a4. White cannot take on a4 because then Black could just play bishop takes d2, queen takes and rook takes a4, winning. Or going back a little bit, another option would be for White to play b4, but then Black just plays a takes b3. And now White's queenside play is damaged permanently. It will be very hard to pursue some strong c4, c5 break. So going back just a little bit, now it makes a little bit more sense why White decided to play b3. And now Black shows a standard idea in a kind of strange scenario. It's c5, which is a bit surprising. I personally wouldn't have expected it, but in retrospect, this seems like a nice move. Here, White could play, for example, d takes and b takes, which kind of transforms the position, and now a3. The idea of a3 is to play b4, b5 in order to undermine the control of d5. Maybe the d5 square can be a nice square for the knight, but actually here, Black can just play knight c5, take, knight e6, heading to d4, and after knight d4, Black has a very comfortable position. It doesn't seem like White has enough time to put severe pressure. So, going back a little bit, in the game White just played a3, and now bishop g5. Now here, white has to make a decision, should he take or not. I mean, he could have taken, he didn't do it, but he could have taken on g5, then pawn takes. And he probably didn't choose to do this because now the control of dark squares is pretty weak for white. That's typically where black thrives, in controlling dark squares. But here, I mean, it's even worse because dark square bishops have been traded. And then the idea of playing g4 seems pretty effective for the future. And white's queenside break with b4 doesn't seem too strong. For example, if you play b4 right away, then take, b6. Take, then rook a1 with trade, and then knight f6. And to be honest, white doesn't have many dangerous targets to pursue. For example, the d6 pawn seems to be the only place to attack. But it's already well protected. And meanwhile, black is already getting some counterplay by playing g4. So going back a little bit, after bishop g5, white chose to play bishop e1, and now both sides kind of rearranged pieces for a little bit. And now it's worthwhile to notice how black has arranged his pieces. I mean, the knight on a6 makes it impossible for white to break with b3, b4, right, which is very important. And then the knight on h6 is supporting the standard f5 break. Notice now the bishop on g5 actually makes it impossible for white to even hope to push f3, f4 break. So, I mean, we could say chances are balanced, but it's nice to see that black is already making some very sensible decisions. And, he has maybe equalized, which is already very good. So then rook e1, bishop d7, okay, a little bit more of piece rearrangement. Probably we could say that white played h3 because sooner or later he was worried that black might play h3 himself. So now black played b6, and black has reached a relatively stable position. We should notice that white is kind of stuck. I mean, both sides are controlled. I mean, it's impossible to break on the queen side, impossible to break on the king side. So now he can kind of move around and try to find a break. Now, if white tried to play knight c3, aiming to play knight a2 and b4 to achieve something, then white can just reply with king h8, then knight g8, and then rook a8. Okay, so the file opens, okay, we go to it, then take, then rook b8. And the position is fairly complicated. Now, for example, white could take and then take, which is dynamically balanced. The pawn on f5 might seem to be hanging, but it's not, because if you take that pawn, then the knight on d2 would be hanging because of the bishop on g5. Now going back a little bit, I mean, it's interesting to notice that white has an interesting exchange sacrifice by taking on d7 and then taking on f5. And now white has only one pawn for the exchange but possesses good control of light squares. And I would definitely encourage anyone watching this video to analyze this position a bit more deeply. It's very instructive. So going back, in the game, white just chose to play queen c3, kind of moving pieces around. And now black decided to go for king h8, didn't want to repeat. The reason for this move is to free the g8 square for the knight, and maybe we could be heading toward h5. Which makes a lot of sense because the g3 square is kind of weak. So then the game continues with king h1, okay. The rooks are a little bit more dangerous on the f file. And now bishop f6. So we should see that even though white is stuck, I mean, black can't be too careless here. For example, black cannot go directly for knight f6, since now white could actually achieve the break. f4, pawn take, then maybe take on f5 first, intermediate move. And then here, I mean, we could already see that black's position is a disaster, because, I mean, just look at the pawns on f5 and h4. They are very weak, very vulnerable. And then, actually, black is in serious danger. For example, I mean, if the game continued with bishop takes, and knight c7, I could just play knight f3, and then take on h4. And both knights are hanging, but they are both protected indirectly because of the check on g6. So white is winning here. Now going back just a little bit, after bishop h2, I mean, this f4 idea is very possible, so here black decided to just play bishop f6. Then queen d3, rook e7, okay, so we go back to g5. Actually here, white can no longer go back, I mean, playing knight e2 and knight f6. Now the knight is coming to h5, and white can no longer play f4 because now the rook on e7 plays a major role. And the game could just continue with knight takes e4, threatening knight f2. Then you take, and white is in serious trouble here. I mean, there are too many lines. both rooks are playing well. This is difficult. He's worse, for sure. So going back a few moves, after bishop g5, white just played rook bd1. And now that the rook is no longer supporting this b4, I mean, black has started to come to the king side with the knight. Now, at this point, I mean, we should wonder, I mean, what would have happened in case white decided to just kind of break the central tension by taking on f5? And we could imagine that this trade would almost certainly benefit black, since files open up in the king side, making it easier to attack. I mean, in particular, we would expect the g file to be very helpful, almost decisive. The problem is that now white also obtains opportunities for counterplay. For example, he could have played knight f1, and now maybe knight f6, which seems natural in order to play knight h5 next move. And now here white can play a precise move f4, which is a pawn sacrifice intended to break black's center. And after pawn take, we trade on e7 and queen f3, and the f4 pawn is actually falling. For example, I mean, if you play queen e5, then knight e2, and actually white is starting to be better here. Or if black plays bishop e8, you know, now there is a threat to attack the rook, then maybe you take on f5 to cover, right? I mean, if I play bishop h5, now bishop g4 is saving the game. But then black can play knight h5, knight g3. And the position is pretty complicated. I might choose to be black just because it seems that the king on h1 is in serious danger. But the position overall is pretty complicated. It's not clear who is better. So going back a little bit. Here the game continued with rook f1. So white is kind of just waiting. And now black played knight f6. So for example, if white now tried to play f4. Okay, so f4, we take, and now g5. Right? This is very powerful because now if we remove the rook, which is necessary, then knight h5, coming to g3, right? And now white can play knight e2, but now f4. White's position is definitely a disaster. I mean, just notice there are so many elements to discuss. For example, I mean, we have the weak g3 square. You know, the e4 pawn is kind of backward. Then there is a file that is very strong. There is a square on e5 that is very powerful. And then notice, for example, the bishop on c2 is not really doing much. While the bishop on d7, well, maybe it's not doing a lot, but you know, it has some useful diagonals. It can play here, or it can also rearrange and play on g6 in order to put some pressure. Now, going back a little bit. So we are saying f4 is not possible. Then white just continues waiting. So rook b1, knight h5, queen h6. Now the possibility of playing f4 has been pretty much completely eliminated forever. And now white played rook fd1, rook h7. So black continues to build more and more pressure while white can't really find an effective plan. Now if white tried to create counterplay, for example play b4, then we could just take and knight a6. Okay, so the knight comes back just in time. And now actually the attempt to create counterplay kind of backfires. Because after you take on c5 and I take with the knight, queen c3, then f takes e4. So f takes e4, then we trade a little bit. And now black can just play knight g3 check. That's a very nice move. I mean, the knight on e2 is hanging. So white can't just move, he has to take. So then take, and now bishop takes h3. So white cannot take because then queen takes decides the game immediately. So instead king g1, check, then take on g2. White can retake. I mean, if you take, then mate. So going back a little bit, white could play king e2, and then bishop c5. So, I mean, here black has an essentially decisive advantage. He's a pawn up. His king is a lot safer, and I mean, maybe some game still needs to be played, but essentially the game is over. Now going back a little bit, another alternative, I mean, if we don't want to break right away, but we want to hope for some kind of counterplay, maybe we can try a move like rook b2, which I mean keeps alive the idea of playing b4, but also helps to hold the game by supporting the second rank. Now white in this position is struggling because I mean he doesn't have a concrete plan, and he just needs to either wait or calculate very concrete variations. I mean here black, for example, can either build more pressure or can just attempt a direct attack. Knight g3, let's look at this. So if white moves king g1, then bishop e3, it's a mate. So instead, knight takes g3, pawn take, bishop take, And now white has to be afraid of two different things. I mean, black could play bishop e3, preparing to break sometime in the future, or he could just go for a break right away by playing pawn takes e4 and then take on h3. Now let's see a forced variation that comes from here. So pawn take, queen take, bishop f4, take, then check, take, queen g2. We're threatening rook h1 mate. So then here the only move is queen e2, and then check and rook h2. And the position is very complex. Maybe I would prefer black, but I mean the position is very complicated. It's not very clear. So going back, that would have been one way for white to play, so this rook b2 might have been the best try. Instead, he played queen c3, which is probably a miscalculation, and now the game didn't go his way when black decided to play knight g3. Very good move. So here there are two options. I mean, black has to calculate, okay, what about bishop takes g3, then pawn take, and then, well, black is maybe taken on e4 and then taken on h3 with the bishop. So here white can just maybe take on f5. And then what about knight takes g3? Well, it turns out it doesn't work. I mean, we can't push, obviously, because I mean, if we push, we expose the rook. But instead, black can just play rook g7. I mean, we are threatening to take on d2 and then win the knight. And then the game might continue with knight e2, rook g8, take on f4, okay. f4 is kind of necessary to connect the queen into the defense. But then, okay, so we take it, we take on f4, and the position is just lost. I mean, white is just one imprecision away from resigning. For example, I mean, the game might continue with rook g1, I start bringing my knight, and then queen h6. And now black will just continue with something like knight g4, knight e3, f4, and then this is just not sustainable. The position just collapses immediately. Now let's give it another try. So going back to knight g3, then I mean maybe white can just play bishop take, pawn take, pawn take, pawn take, and now knight f1 instead of taking on g3. It makes sense here to play rook g7, preparing f4. For example, if you take right now, I mean, because otherwise I'll probably just play f4 and then this break. So then maybe take on g3 right now, bishop f4, double. And now this is the key. Black is winning on the spot with rook takes g2. Because knight takes g2 loses to queen takes h3, knight h2, and then mate. So after knight g3, white took knight takes g3. So now pawn take, bishop takes, bishop e3. And this is a key move. It takes away the g1 square, so it kind of traps the king. And now the game just continued with knight f1. So for example, if white had played bishop h2, then black can just take, then take, now it's threatening mate. Knight f1 is the only move, and now black can take rook takes f3. If white takes, that's a checkmate, so the only response is queen c2, but now rook f2. And the game is very easily decided because the queen is lost. So going back just a little bit, so after bishop h2, the point of that would have been that f4 doesn't really work because queen d3, then take, and then queen e2 is kind of holding. But the other variation destroys white's hopes. So going back, after bishop e3, the game continued with knight f1, f4. And here white could have put some resistance by taking on e3 and then playing knight g4. It blocks the threat of bishop takes h3, but unfortunately bishop takes and then rook f2. The threat rook takes g2 is too strong, so then the only thing that white can really do is take on g3 and give up the piece. He might be able to play for a while, but essentially we all know that the game is lost. So this is why white didn't play this. So going back, after f4 white played bishop h2 and then bishop takes h3. It is possible that he underestimated this. Taking on e3 doesn't help because of bishop takes g2 and then the bishop on h2 is hanging, and that's lost. So going back a little bit, after pawn takes, then queen takes, and now, I mean, we are taking on f3 with a checkmate, so the only response is rook d2. And now the game continues with take, queen takes. And we have reached a position of material imbalance. I mean, white has two bishops for the rook and the two pawns, But the key here is that he doesn't really have any good squares or diagonals for his minor pieces, while black has a very clear plan, which is just pushing the pawns. So the game could be said to be winning for black already. Now here white played queen g2 and then queen h5, f3, and now rook f4. It's a very nice rook transfer. And then a couple moves later the game was over with rook b2, rook g4, and rook g2. And here white resigned, because if he decides to take on g2, then pawn take, and then the bishop is hanging, right? And then if he does something else, like try to hold the position like this, then after queen takes and rook takes, that's a checkmate. This is a very interesting game. I mean, we could say that, black had to kind of move around for a while before he was able to find a very concrete winning method, but eventually it worked out. The key, though, was to kind of hold white's plans and kind of not allow these plans to make any progress. So you notice that up until the end of the game, white was never able to achieve any of his two standard breaks. So basically b4 was not possible and f4 was not possible. And then black just had a lot of time to move around the pieces until he found the right tactical threat in order to create a checkmate attack. So I hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.